Everybody. Happy Friday. Good to see you. Hi. Hello. Good to see you. Hi. Okay. Oops. There we go. Happy Friday. Welcome to the best part of my week. We're going to let people in for another couple of minutes, and then we'll get started. Hi, everyone. Great. Hi, everybody. We're going to wait for one more minute because we still have a very steady stream of folks coming into the waiting room. So we're going to wait for one more minute and then we're going to get started. Welcome. We have lots of people here who have been here before and a lot of people here who are coming for the first time. So welcome back. And welcome if it's your first time. We're very happy to see you. Yeah, it's an excellent group of people. Okay. We are going to get started with a little bit of housekeeping. And I'm going to share my screen for a minute. There we go. Okay, so welcome to Talking Data Equity. This is an event that is being recorded, and it's being recorded for a very specific reason. It's being recorded so that you can watch it again if you have questions. And you can, oops, I'm so sorry. I shared the wrong link. I actually shared a link to a very cool foundation in Nebraska. Let's try that again. All right, great. Okay, so this session is being recorded, and it's being recorded so that we can share it on the We All Count Data Equity Community Forum. There are lots of people who can't join us for Talking Data Equity Fridays at noon, my time, Toronto time, and they watch it online. So that's the reason that we're recording it. So you can ask questions and use the chat as you like, knowing that it's being recorded to share in the We All Count Data Equity Forum. So again, welcome. We have a bunch of new people joining us today, which is very exciting. It's always very good news. And of course, we have lots of our old friends and colleagues that we look forward to seeing every Friday. I certainly look forward to seeing every Friday. And here's the deal. My name is Heather Kraus. I am a mathematical statistician, and I'm the founder of an organization called We All Count. And We All Count is a project for equity in data science. And one of the things that we do, one of my favorite things we do, is we get together on Fridays at noon my time, because I live in Toronto, in Canada, and we talk about how to actually do things, how to actually start embedding equity in our work, and specifically in our quantitative data projects. And this is an informal group. It's run as a Zoom meeting, which Zoom always tells us we can't do with a couple hundred people that don't know each other. But every Friday we prove Zoom wrong. So this is how the logistics work. We use the chat. And there's two ways to use the chat. You can use the chat with the drop-down menu set to everyone. And if you do that, then everybody who's here will be able to see your comment, see your question, respond, share their ideas. If you don't feel comfortable sharing your comment or your question in the public chat, set that Zoom drop-down menu to my name, which is Heather Kraus, and you can send me a direct message and I'll do my best to answer your question or amplify your comment without sharing your name. My ability to get to all the questions really depends on the week. Some weeks we talk about a specific issue. Sometimes we talk about a really technical advanced issue, like a specific, type of Bayesian analysis. Sometimes we talk about less technical things like how to get communities involved and make sure that voices are centered. And sometimes we have guest speakers. Next week, we have a very exciting guest speaker. We have Mish going to be our guest speaker next week. So we're very excited about that. And today we have a topic. So the topic for today is data collection of demographic and social identity data. Which categories should we use? How many categories should we use? What names or labels on those categories should we use? And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, about my experience with that and the tools that I use. And then like usual, we're just going to open it up to broader discussion. I know lots of you here have all kinds of experiences with this. So after I share a couple of slides, we're going to open it up to whoever wants to ask questions, share their experiences. Okay, so the next couple of minutes, I'm going to share some slides. And if you have questions during that period, just go ahead and plop them into the chat. You don't have to wait until the end. You can feel free to have as many conversations in the chat while I am presenting. You do not have to wait. This is an informal gathering. We're just hanging out Friday. Okay. So I get asked this question many, many times every week. And what most people are hoping for is like a list. So if you want to collect gender data with an equity lens, here's the list of categories or names that you should use. Or if you want to collect ethnicity data, here's the list. Now, of course, if you've been coming to Talking Data Equity for a while now, you know that that's not what we're going to do today, that we've heard from enough specialists, enough people with all kinds of lived experiences that there is no equitable way to come up with a single list of the way that all projects across all communities should collect gender data or should collect race data. It's just much too context specific. So instead, the way that I approach how to align the way that we collect our demographic and social identity data with the equity goals of our project is to try and come up with a list of questions or choices that you are going to think about along the way. So I'm going to talk about those questions and choices in terms of two threads. And then at the very end, I'm going to show you a practical tool that we use. So the two threads we're going to talk about are, what are the consequences of your categories? And the second thread is, what do you want to get from your categories? Because both of these things are going to help you figure out when I'm collecting data, what categories should I use? So thread one is, what are the consequences of your categories? And this is something that we're not often given a lot of training in. Even, if you have advanced degrees from fancy places, you're often not taught to think really carefully about what does it mean to double down on these identities. Every time we ask a question about what race you are, or what sexual identity you are, or what your disability status is, or what your immigration status is, every time that we ask this question when we're collecting demographic data, we're doubling down on the socially constructed reality that these characteristics matter, that these characteristics can be quantified, and that they're important ways of seeing the world. Now, I am not saying that this is always wrong or always bad and you should never do it, but I'm saying that we should never do it lightly. Anytime we're going to collect data and we're going to ask these questions, it should require some serious thinking through about what are the consequences going to be. Do I really need to know this information? Is it good for the people that I'm collecting data from? And sometimes we forget this in our kind of rush towards wanting to do data equity. Sometimes we think, well, the first thing we have to do is collect tons of social identity data and disaggregate all of our findings by this data, and that's going to get us to equity. And sometimes that might be in alignment with your equity goals, but also that is the fastest way to accidentally harm the people that you care about. So before we rush to start asking a bunch of social identity and demographic data questions, is a responsibility to spend a little bit of time thinking about what the consequences are going to be. And to answer some of the logistical questions in the chat, yes, this is being recorded. You can find the recording and the slides in our data equity form. I will share that again at the end. So this is the first thing to think about, realizing, do you really need this data? And who is collecting this data potentially going to harm? And that's becoming a very serious question in some parts of the world right now. Unfortunately, we're exposing people to some very serious harm when we do ask them certain types of demographic questions. So when considering the consequences of what you're going to ask, we also need to think about the consequences of how we're going to ask. What phrasing are we going to use? What names are we going to use? What actual nuanced, explicit characteristic of the person are we asking about? This is all wrapped up in what are the consequences of collecting this data? What are the consequences and to whom? You can see that these are three really different questions that are going to have really different consequences for different people who live in different social locations, and they're going to benefit the person asking the question in a different way. And this is what equity is about. Data equity isn't about collecting as much social identity data as possible. It's about paying attention to the power dynamics of the way that we are collecting data and using data. Who benefits from this if we really think it through all the way to the end? Because anytime that we're creating or adopting categories of people, we become responsible for that. And so it's really important to take that responsibility seriously and consider, what is our line? When are we going to ask this question? And when are we not going to ask this question? And if we're going to ask the question, who are we going to privilege or prioritize when we do ask the question? If I ask you the question, which of these best reflects your marital status? or your relationship status, sorry, which of these best reflects your relationship status? And I give you these two choices. Anybody who sees themselves at all in this dichotomy, they're getting privileged. They are getting prioritized. But what if I say, which of these best reflects your relationship status? And I give you these options. These options are not more or less scientific. These options are not more or less objective. These options are not more or less correct. The biggest difference between these options is whose lived experience they prioritize. So we're going to need to be able to answer that question. Part of the consequences of using certain categories of race, relationship status, immigration status, gender, is that we're reinforcing certain worldviews, certain lived experiences. We're validating them, we're norming them. And you can think of it like a t-shirt. So when you have a t-shirt, I might have a t-shirt that I lend to my friend. My friend can maybe get that t-shirt on, but it's really, really tight. They're not comfortable. They're not happy, but they can get it on. And I put the t-shirt on and it fits me great. All demographic data categories are like that. There might be a lot of people answering your survey question or filling out your demographic question who can kind of check a box, but there's only going to be a small number of people or a certain proportion of your sample who feels like, yes, that's a t-shirt that I will wear. That's a t-shirt that fits me perfectly. Those are the people whose lived experiences, whose worldviews are getting privileged when you ask the question in this way. And again, this is something that the person or team who chooses what categories and names to use, that person or team is deciding who's going to get a good fit, is deciding who is going to be privileged in the way that we're collecting this data. So that's thread number one. What are the consequences of this? Who is this good for? Who does this expose to risk? And who's getting privileged? Okay. Thread number two is, what are you actually trying to measure? If we are going to collect demographic data, what do you need to understand? What is the purpose of collecting this demographic data? There's many, many different options. For example, you might be trying to measure administrative categories. So administrative categories are something that like a governmental body or a regulatory body has decided is the administrative way that they are going to categorize people. For example, the United States federal government has a specific list of administrative categories that it uses for all kinds of demographics. It's really well known, the racial categories that are administratively used by the federal government. They're trying to measure an administrative category. That's very different than trying to measure somebody's lived experience of their racial identity. And that's one of the places that we can get confused or that we can lose our way when we start measuring demographics, is if we don't realize that we're trying to measure administrative categories. We're not trying to measure lived experience. Or maybe our project is trying to measure an experience of discrimination. And instead of asking questions that'll help us measure discrimination, we accidentally collect data in an administrative category. Or are we trying to understand somebody's cultural affiliation? Or are we trying to understand somebody's self-identity? These are not the exhaustive list of all things you might be trying to understand. There's dozens and dozens of things you might be trying to understand, whether you're collecting race data, disability data, sexual orientation data, immigration status data. It's really important to get very, very specific about what you're trying to understand, because if you get very specific about what you're trying to understand, that's when you're going to know what categories to use. It's going to become much, much easier if you are unambiguous about what you're trying to understand. It'll become much easier to know what question you should ask and what categories you should use. And whatever categories you decide to use, it's critically important that you say where those categories and names came from. Because again, that's who's in a position of power. The person or team or organization that lays boxes out in a field and asks human beings to sort themselves into those boxes, even if those people are getting to sort themselves into boxes, even if they're getting to self-identify, those aren't the people who are in the biggest position of power in terms of the results that are going to come out of your demographic data. It is the person or the team or the organization who gets to decide what the categories and names are. And so it is really, really an important principle to explicitly say where these categories came from, to explicitly say that when you're collecting the data as part of informed consent. When we're asking somebody for informed consent, they need to know this, we're asking you to step into such and such an organization's worldview about how disability works or how race works or how ethnicity works. And when it comes time to write your report, very important to be able to say whose worldview produced these numbers. Okay, so last thing I'm going to show you before we get to talking is I'm going to show you a tool that we use to help have some conversations. So some of you are asking in the chat, how do you include the community whose data you're collecting and deciding what those groups, what those categories should be, what the names should be? How do you even have a conversation in your own team? And it can be tricky because we're talking about really abstract conceptual things. And you need to make a really practical decision. And oftentimes, especially right now, the impulse is, well, we are going to collect as many identities as possible. And if we're going to collect, say, gender identity, rather than just asking to a gender binary, we are going to collect as many as possible. And of course, this is an understandable impulse because lots of times what we want is to be really inclusive. It's not bad that we want to be really inclusive, but it's not always good for equity when you're doing a data project. And part of the reason it's not always good for equity when you're doing a data project is because when we're working with quantitative data, what we're trying to do is put people into groups and get numerical estimates of what's going on in those groups. That's what quantitative data is for. Quantitative data is not for getting a nuanced understanding of each individual's experience or outcomes. If that's the purpose of your project, you should probably use qualitative data or use another way of knowing. Because what quantitative data is good at is sorting people into groups and then estimating what's going on for those groups. So the number of groups that we use makes a really big difference into how good the information is that we have about the people in the groups. And we've talked about that before. We've talked a lot about how to deal with small sample sizes. But what we're talking about here is what size of a group do you want to create when you're collecting data? You're looking at a balance between people being able to see themselves in your data collection and having precise, specific results. And they're often in opposition to each other quantitatively. So we use a tool that has two dials to talk about this with our research teams and with the community that's getting their data collected. First dial is called the fit dial, and the fit dial shows how likely it is that a person can see themselves in the way that they're being asked to select a category. In other words, how good of a fit is that t-shirt? That's the fit dial. The certainty dial is how confident are we that the answers that we're getting from our survey, from our data collection tool, represent what's actually happening in the world. That's called certainty. And we want to talk about how these dials go back and forth when we collect data differently. So, for example, let's say that we're doing a project that's trying to get an understanding of how people in my city feel about a proposed new law. And I want to divide this out by sexual orientation. And so I have to decide, what categories am I going to use when I collect data about sexual orientation? This is one possibility. There are many possibilities. This is one. I can say, which of these best describe your sexual orientation, straight or LGBTQ? If I collect data in this way, the fit dial here is going to be very low, because there are lots of people who are not going to see themselves in one of these categories. They're not going to feel like, yeah, that's a t-shirt I want to take off the rack and put on me. That's a good fit for me. It's going to be low. Certainty, though, is going to be really high, because when I look at the data that I collect in only these two categories, the sample sizes in my city, this isn't going to be the same in every city, but in my city, the sample sizes are going to be pretty big in both of these. So I'm going to have a pretty high level of certainty. This is one option. But what if I'm like, actually, the purpose of my project, and this is why the purpose of your project matters and how you're going to collect data. The purpose of my project, we actually need better fit. I need more people to see themselves in my data collection tool. So I need this fit dial to go up. So one of the ways to do that is to get more specific about the options that I'm giving people. And when I give people all of these options, the fit does go up. So it's more likely now that the people in my city that are getting this data collection tool find here a category that feels really right to them. And what I give up for that increased fit is certainty, because some of these groups are going to have much smaller sample sizes. So because we're doing quantitative analysis, not qualitative analysis, the certainty is going to go down. And an important thing to note is that that might be okay. Not every single data project needs extremely high levels of certainty. It depends on the purpose, how it's going to be used. I'm doing public opinion surveys, so my level of certainty isn't nearly the same as it needs to be if I'm, say, doing medical research. Very different purposes. And that's good, because I'm going to get a whole bunch of different levels of certainty. This plus or minus, we're not going to go into the technical details, but this plus or minus is how certain we are that this is going to represent what's actually going on in my city. You can see that I've got a lot better fit, but some of these have certainty that's really big. 17% plus or minus. That's really big. 13% plus or minus. Really big. One thing I might do is to try and get better certainty is I might take a whole bunch of people and roll them up into a single category. In this case, this is not the only option, and I'm not even saying this is a good or the best option. I'm just saying it's a commonly used option to roll a whole bunch of people up into an aggregate category. This does get us some better certainty, but there's two problems with this. First problem with this is that we're putting people in a category that they did not choose, right? If I ask you in a survey how tall you are and you say I'm 5'5", and then I aggregate you up into a category of people who are 5'7" and under, I'm putting you in a category that you're a measurable subset of. That is not true with this. I am putting lots of people into a category that they never said they were a part of. It's my worldview that's now being imposed on a bunch of people. So that's a human problem with this. And a mathematical problem with this is that we're going to get better certainty, but we're going to get better certainty by combining information about a whole bunch of people that don't feel the same way about our law, right? We're trying to get good information about how somebody feels about our law. And I'm getting a bigger sample size, but I'm combining people who are very much in support of this law with people who are very much not in support of this law. So a good sample size that contains a lot of people who actually maybe aren't part of the same group, maybe is something that you would want to reconsider. You have lots and lots of other options of ways to collect data. That's what we're talking about here, right? What categories you should use when you're going to collect demographic data. What are the consequences of those categories? The human consequences and the mathematical consequences. So here's another option that in some ways, in some situations, solves a couple of these issues. It allows for more informed consent. It allows for people who are getting their data collected to understand what's actually happening and going to happen with their data, and allows them to see specifically what categories are going to be collected and presented. Because when we collect data this way, we ask the people to select a letter option. So A, B, C, D, E, F, and so on. We ask them to select the letter that best represents their lived experience. But we let them know right from the jump that when we make our report, we're going to be reporting by the numbered categories because we need a certain level of certainty for these results to be accepted. So this tool can be very, very useful for having very grounded conversations. You can actually get a dial and take it with you to a community meeting and have a conversation together about, what is the purpose of our project? How important is fit? How important is certainty? Because sometimes I've absolutely over and over had situations where I'm talking with a community group that wants to do some quantitative work, and they start out wanting to ask very, very, very nuanced demographic questions. And then once we think through how that's actually going to dilute some of the power and kind of give away some of the purpose of why they're trying to collect this information, they realize that maybe it's okay that everybody doesn't see their individual demographic information in the data collection tool, so that we can have a really powerful understanding of what's going on for a non-dominant group. Because that's one thing that's really important to understand. It's the last thing I'm going to say before I show you a couple of examples, is that this level of certainty, how this goes up and down, and the level of fit, how that goes up and down, is different for different groups of people. And it is the dominant and privileged groups of people that often get fit and certainty at the same time. In my city, if you can check this box, you are going to have a lot of fit and a lot of certainty, regardless of how many other nuanced identities I do or do not include in the data tool. So sometimes, not always, but sometimes, including a lot of nuance in the non-dominant identities can dilute the quantitative insights that we can get, and actually accidentally perpetuates and norms the privileged and dominant demographic, which is usually the exact opposite of what we're trying to do. So this is why I can't give you a list of rules, but I have to give you a list of things to think about. I'm going to give you a couple of examples, and then I'm going to stop talking. So if, for example, we wanted to understand a company's pay equity under legally protected classes. So if the purpose of this survey that was trying to collect sexual orientation data, and we're trying to decide what categories should we use, if the purpose is to do a pay equity analysis for a company, and we want to know, do they have equal pay under legally protected classes? Question we might ask is, what administrative sexual orientation category would you like to be sorted into? That's very different than saying, what's your sexual orientation? And it is very specific. It says exactly why we're collecting this data and what we're trying to understand. And we're only giving them 2 broad categories because that's all we need to know in order to understand, is this company being equitable in terms of the legally protected classes? We could collect really nuanced data, but that would be exposing these companies' employees to a bunch of risk. So we chose not to do that in this case. And we didn't ask them about their lived experience. We didn't ask them about their identity. We asked them about how they fit into the federal government's administrative system, how they want to be sorted. Another situation, we're working with a school, and that school wants to understand if its interventions are having an effect on the rates of homophobic bullying. Now, this is really, really tricky. And there's a number of different ways that we could do this. So I am not saying this is the best way to do this. I'm saying this is one way to do this. Regardless of your sexual orientation, have you ever experienced homophobic bullying? Yes, no, or unsure. So this is a way to collect data without having to expose young people to the risk of identifying their sexual orientation, which can be legally sensitive, but not just legally sensitive. It can also be emotionally sensitive. There is a whole spectrum amongst young people about where they are in understanding and feeling comfortable about their sexual orientation. And we're actually trying to understand homophobic bullying here. And if you've ever been to high school, you know that there are people who experience homophobic bullying that are heterosexual, are gay, are queer, are a wide variety of different sexual orientations. But that's not what we're trying to measure. Okay, different situation. We want to understand a community's need for educational materials and health practitioners who can provide PrEP. Really, really important health issues. And when we're doing health issues, that's one of the places where we have to be so clear about what we're trying to measure. AJ talked a little bit about this when they were here. And so rather than accidentally stigmatizing people or sorting people into groups based on our worldview, we need to ask what we need to know. Have you ever, or do you think you might ever have sex with a man? Yes, no, unsure. And again, I am in no way saying that this is the only or best way. I'm saying this is one way. Last one I'm going to show you. We want to understand the nuanced diversity of self-identities of people who are attending our health clinic. So this time, we are trying to understand somebody's lived experience, not their administrative categories, not their sexual activities, not their health choices, and not their lived experiences. We're trying to understand their self-identity, and we're trying to do so in a way that gives the greatest chance of as many people seeing themselves fit into this data collection tool as possible. So this is where we are going to ask a community-informed list of more nuanced sexual orientations. Again, this is not the list. This is the list that was community-informed by the people we were trying to understand. Okay. So I am going to pause and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm just because there are a lot of new folks here, which we're very happy about. And so we're having some logistical questions. This link in the chat, that link is where the recording will be. And that link is where the slides will be. And that link is also where you can ask lots and lots more questions after today, because we will only be together for about 20 more minutes today. And I'm sure you'll have questions later. So you can keep asking questions at that link. Okay. Enough talking from me. I'm going to go through the chat and answer questions. But before I go through the chat, is there anybody in the room that wants to raise their hand and unmute themselves to ask a question or share an experience? It doesn't have to be a question, wants to contribute. Excellent. Okay, Rebecca, go ahead. If I said your name incorrectly, please fix that for me.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, it's always nice to be here in community with everyone. I was wondering where you find space to be transparent around your choices with the question being asked or the phrasing in the scope of, say, a survey, without like inundating a page with, and we made this be after this many iterations and this many conversations. And so how to maintain transparency around what you've done within the scope of like actually collecting the information.
So that is a great question. And it really depends on the format and the technology that we're using to collect the data. Some formats lend themselves quite well to this. Ironically, paper works really well for this because you can simply, if you're doing a paper survey, you can simply put the list of categories and then a sentence. It's not longer than 7 words usually, which is these categories were adopted from, and then you say where the categories were adopted from. There's also room in most technological platforms to put that information as well. And we recommend usually putting that information after you put the categories. So not before the categories, because I do agree that that is gonna cause confusion to a lot of people, and also feel unpleasant to a lot of users. So we want to find a balance between providing really good informed consent and having people feel comfortable. The other option, if most of the demographic questions have adopted categories from the same place, if your organization chose them, or if they're all federally mandated, or they're all from whatever, you put that in the actual informed consent right up top, where we hope that we've given people plenty of time to relax and read that informed consent. But also, the last thing I'll say is that in terms of overwhelming people with surveys, and I've been doing raw survey data collection for many, many decades, and I know the temptation to ask a 2-hour survey. And I'm not saying that you do, but if somebody is asking a survey that is overwhelming, they probably haven't spent enough time in thread 1, which is, what are the consequences of this data collection activity? Oftentimes, again, I'm not attributing this to you, but I'm providing support for what you can say to the person who's going to say to you, we can't do this because it's going to be too long or take too much space, which is often some of the pushback we hear about almost anything we want to do for equity. There's not enough time. If there isn't enough time to do your research in an equitable way, should we be doing that research? Like, who is that research good for if we acknowledge that we don't have enough time to do it well? So, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Good to see you. Good to see you. Hey, Dennis.
Hi, everybody.
Hey.
Apologies. It's good to see you.
Great to see you.
Likewise. All right. So what I was thinking about just listening is that this is overall a great primer into the importance of a really good survey methodologist or a good survey methodology program. The downstream concern that we have here is an analysts, and by the way, I'm an analyst. So when people like myself can be charged with analyzing data that have been collected in these potentially troublesome categories. By then, the damage may have already been done. So my question here that I'll open up to everyone, have you come across any recommendations for how to provide equitable analyses, given that this may be a very common occurrence?
Great question. You can see in the chat, it is enthusiastically shared by many people. And I'd love to hear what other people have to say. And I think it depends a lot on what level of damage or risk you think has been done. Here in Canada, where I live, if you are the type of engineer that builds bridges, you have to pass an ethics exam. And that's because if you build a bridge with crappy material and somebody dies, that's your responsibility. And unfortunately, we find ourselves in a world where, and again, this, I'm not talking about you, but analysts as a profession, we are now making decisions on a regular basis that influence significant parts of people's lives. And just like an engineer has to make a decision about, where's the line about the level of quality you're going to require in the materials for your bridge, it's our responsibility to give some forethought, think through in advance the exact question that you're asking, which is, when is a data set so shoddy or so damaging to the people that it was collected from that I actually can't build my analysis with it? I can't build that bridge. And it's something that very, very little professional education is devoted to. And it's a very, very serious problem. And I don't have an answer. I don't have oh, you just quantify it like this. But what I do know, and this is actually happening in these Friday events, is that like any collective, there's strength in numbers. As more researchers, as more analysts realize our responsibility, and I include myself very much in this, as we collectively realize our power, it's going to get easier to say no. It's going to take a collective to not be willing to use some types of data, but it is going to be possible. And the other thing, bottom line, is if you do decide to move ahead with analysis with data that you didn't collect, it is imperative that it is plainly stated where that data came from and how that data was collected, so that anybody that's looking at that number, like that 25% on that slide that I showed, anybody who's looking at that 25% and is considering whether to make a life decision based on that 25%, they'll know whose worldview they're amplifying or aligning with if they're going to adopt that 25%, because the actual numbers change, right? But maybe that's, there's a couple of requests in the chat for specific examples. I definitely have some specific examples in my professional life where I have walked away from a data set. But I think it is a really interesting idea to kind of create some set of examples. I think it would be almost impossible to create guidance or rules, but examples might be, I tend towards being more comfortable creating examples that other people can decide to adopt or not. Anyone else want to unmute themselves? And while you decide if you're going to unmute yourselves, I'm going to kind of scroll through this long list of questions. If there's a question you want to amplify, raise your hand and amplify it, because there's tons of questions. And since I was talking today, I wasn't able to reply to any questions while they were going by. Let's see. Here's an interesting comment, a good topic. I think it's important to allow people to choose multiple categories. For example, somebody could be both transgender and heterosexual. A person could be queer and have another identity. Same is true for race, right? Lots of people have more than one race. Allowing people to choose multiple categories is a very important choice with, of course, very important fit and certainty implications and huge analytical implications, because how you're going to make sense of that data is a whole second choice in what you believe, what's your philosophy. And we did a talking data equity on that. So if you go to our forum, you will be able to see our conversations about how to handle that multiple choice data, because it is tricky, which isn't a reason not to do it. Just because something's tricky doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. Yes, there's a bunch of questions that are really, really good questions about specific words, like should we use the word other or should we use the word additional? Should we use the word Hispanic? Should we use the word Latino? Should we use the word Latinx? Should we use the word First Nations? Should we use the word American Indian? And like everything else, there isn't an answer. The best practice is absolutely thinking of it, framing it in your mind like you are applying a name to a human being. And you're going to want to ask that human being which name they would prefer. And if you're working for an organization that is, you know, an intermediary or a couple of steps away from the people that you're collecting data from, ask the closest person that you can get to. Because I think Michelle was talking about this just last week at Michelle Cisa. Yeah, she was. Michelle Cisa was just talking about this, about how you can absolutely find somebody that'll make a very strong case for the term First Nations, and another person that'll make a very strong case for the word American Indian. And they are right for them, of course, but they're not necessarily right for other people that might check the same box. And so humility is incredibly important. Yeah. I personally am not a fan of the word other. I don't personally like that word. I use the word additional. Additional identity is not listed here. But that is not a rule that everybody should follow. Yes. The issue around two-spirit, I also refer you to last week's Talking Data Equity. You can watch the recording. Michelle Cisa talked about that really, really well. Yeah. And there's some people quoting guidance on different topics from different organizations. And that's a good way to do it. If you're going to adopt a specific organization's recommendations, make sure that you say that you're adopting that organization's recommendations. Just checking if anybody has their hand up. Great. Somebody is suggesting if you're using a digital technology to collect your data, you can use that hover. So some survey collection technology has a hover function. So if you're asking which of these represents your disability status, and you're hovering over it with your cursor or with a mouse or with a finger, a little rollover bar will come up, and it can in there tell you about where the information came from, where those categories came from. That's a great suggestion if you're using that kind of technology. Hey, Diego. Go ahead.
Hi, Heather. I had a quick question that I'm dealing with right now is about the including, I prefer not to answer, and how to deal with that in terms of the data. We've had pushbacks, different things. We work in a place where actually we're requiring people to self-identify. People have obviously most of the time the option, but some of the questions we don't have an option because they're like ingrained in the way we work. So I just wanted to hear you about I prefer not to option it. And sideway to that, also the option to opt out completely from this, from self-declaring, self-identifying, and how to embed that data back into your own analysis. People who opt out, or people who prefer not to answer. Thank you.
Great question. Really good question, Diego. And so there's a couple of different threads. I would say that if you were going to not allow people to opt out, you're going to have a very strong reasoning behind that. If they aren't allowed to opt out, I would think it would be pretty much necessary to supply that, prefer not to say option. I personally, in a situation where we're going to recommend people answer the question, I really like the prefer not to say option, because I think that that's a very informative option. And what it tells you really depends, again, on who's collecting the data, what question you're asking, and what you're trying to understand. But it's a very useful piece of information about the level of, I'm not going to characterize it. I was going to say the level of trust, but it won't always be the level of trust. It's a very informative piece of information about the relationship that the data responders have with the data collectors. And that relationship is critical. It's critical to all the numbers that are going to come out. So simply analyzing demographics broken out by the percentage of people who would answer the question and wouldn't answer the question is sometimes a much more informative piece of information than the nuanced demographics. So I never throw that data out. I never put that data into a category called other, or I never mark it as missing, because it's not missing. Somebody has shared a very useful piece of information with you that maybe didn't answer the exact question that you were hoping they would answer, but they probably answered a more valuable question. You can also ask why. How some survey technologies, not all of them, but some survey technologies have an option for other, and then there's a small window where you can write these specifics in if you want. It can be the same thing for prefer not to say. Asking them why is incredibly useful. Good to see you. Mithra, help me if I'm not saying your name right.
Yeah, it's Mirtha. Thank you.
It's me. Sorry?
Mirtha.
Okay, great. Thank you for helping me.
So I work with an organization. We do student support. And one of our biggest things that we do with surveys is update student information. One thing that I've been struggling with is how often do we ask a student if their, for example, gender, sexual orientation has changed, pronouns, all of that. Right now, we've been doing mid-year and end of the year surveys to try to update that information along with other academic info that they might update us with. But I worry about asking too many times a year, like, did your gender change? Did your sexuality change? Did your pronouns change? So wondering if you have any thoughts around that.
Great question. Thank you so much for asking it, because that touches on a topic that I didn't cover today because I didn't want to talk for the whole time, but building in data collection systems that can be dynamic, especially around things like gender identity, racial identity, preferred pronouns, sexual orientation. All of those things need to be dynamic. The day of the static binary are over. And for young people, I would think once a year would be the minimum. And it would depend very much like what's being said in the chat right now. It would depend on what you're trying to do with the data. If you're providing medical services based on that data, because I know some school districts do, some school districts don't. But if you're providing health services, you're going to need a very accurate, up-to-date information. If you're trying to get an understanding of maybe like disciplinary trends and equity and disciplinary trends in your school, you definitely don't need to ask more than once a year. You could probably ask once a year, or even every other year. So it's very, very good that you're asking it more than once. And the rate is going to depend on a balance between making sure that it's up to date and making the students feel surveilled, I guess I would say. Okay. There are so many questions in the chat that I did not get to, but that doesn't mean they're not valuable. And we will also do our best. If you want to go ahead, if you have questions that are outstanding that you didn't get an answer to, ask them in the forum. Myself and a couple of other folks from We All Count are in this forum a lot. We love to get your questions, and we would be happy to have extensive conversations about demographic data. One of the best ways to understand equity, one of the best ways to accidentally reinforce racism is demographic data. So, okay, we have to leave it there. It's top of the hour. Have a great weekend. Thank you for coming. You're an amazing community. That is the highlight of my week every single week. Would be nothing without you. If this was your first time, come back next week. We have a very special guest speaker, Mish, next week, and it'll be wonderful. So I'll see you then. Okay. Bye, everybody.